and welcome to this video cast for subscribers to davidicke.com. Well, as I'm recording this, they have announced an attempt to install a ceasefire of sorts in Syria, though the parties involved, the United States and Russia, don't seem to be too confident that it will go anywhere. And when you look at the history, with good reason. But whatever happens in the short term in relation to that, the long-term plan that I've been exposing since way back in the books and talks has quite demonstrably continued apace this week. And by that, I mean the clearly systematic demonization of Russia. What I've been saying all these years going, like I say, way back to a time when Russia was not considered a threat, when China was, it's joining the West now. It's becoming an economically Western country, and they're buying lots of things and all that stuff. Even then, what I was saying was that the plan of the global hidden hand was for a third world war between the West, predominantly, of course, led by the United States, against Russia and China. And of course, it's all dismissed by the mainstream. Oh, that Icke, he's a nutter. But now it's fricking happening for anyone with half a brain cell on active duty. The demonization of Russia in multiple ways is designed to prepare the global public to accept a conflict with that country, to protect the West. And after, like I say, all these years since I first started saying this was the global plan, we had this week the Pentagon announcing a list of the biggest threats to the world. Who was at the top? Russia. Who was second? China. A somber report released Wednesday by General Martin Dempsey, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Pentagon, warns of a low but growing possibility of the US fighting a war with a major power with immense consequences. It's the plan. It's always been the plan. And that plan is to create a third world war, to change the face of human society and introduce a completely different global society based on total control. Nothing changes the world more fundamentally or quicker than wars. Look at Syria, a prosperous, bustling country, now in an absolute mess, in turmoil, in tatters because of a war. The First World War, all planned, as I detail in my books, changed the world completely. The Second World War took it even further. And what was the common theme? Continual centralization of power after each war. And the plan is for a third world war involving the West and Russia, China, to complete the job of centralizing power on a global level, dictating to every man, woman and child on planet Earth. That is what it's all about. And so this Dempsey chap at the Pentagon said in this announcement revealing this list that Russia has repeatedly demonstrated that it does not respect the sovereignty of its neighbours and is willing to use force to achieve its goals. This man, like everyone involved in this in the United States and Britain, has no shame whatsoever. How they can talk about this stuff and say those words without choking is one of the great wonders of the world to me. When you consider that Britain and the United States and others like France have been bombing and destroying and taking over countries by force decade after decade after decade. Russia's military actions, he said, are undermining regional security directly through proxy forces. Proxy forces? He's got to be choking now, surely. United States and Britain uses proxy forces all over the place. It's using them now in Syria under code names like moderate rebels and ISIS, of course, which they're fundamentally behind. And it says here in this article that the 2011 report by the Pentagon spoke little of Russia. No, because this global takeover by this hidden hand has a sequence that it's following, has steps it's following. In 2011, the step to start demonizing Russia to prepare for a third world conflict wasn't at that point. Now it is, and so you're seeing this demonization, including a BBC film program based on the fact that Russia had basically invaded Latvia, and the NATO countries had to react to protect its sovereignty, and it ended in a nuclear exchange, all preparing the public mind for, be afraid of Russia. And NATO, of course, which is a world army under anything but directly being named as such, NATO's head said he approved the American proposal for a major increase in armaments and troops to be based in Europe. This also came out this week, in the wake of Russian aggression. And what he's talking about in terms of Russian aggression, of course, is Ukraine, where the West, brackets United States, Britain, NATO, all those usual suspects, imposed a coup upon Ukraine, removed an elected leader. He might not have been a nice man, but he was an elected leader, and put in their puppet, Poroshenko. And they've used that ever since to, again, demonize Russia. Now, I mentioned that the idea is to create this war, and then after the war, the idea is to say, look, we can't go on like this. So what we're going to have is a world army, which one journalist said to me once, well, he called himself a journalist, what's the use of a world army? There'd be no one to fight. How about the population and keeping the population under control? The idea to create the world army is to impose the will of what they want after this war, which is a world government. And the world army is being moved into place more and more and more under the name of NATO, among other things. And after this war that they're planning, we let them get away with it, they are going to announce some kind of peace deal, which will be to redraw global society in the image that they planned all along. Now, in my new book, Phantom Self, I quote an insider who described the world that was coming in 1969. And what he described, not only in terms of this, but in all the changes we're seeing in human society today, He was spot on in detail all those years ago, 1969. And I just mentioned that BBC program about a nuclear exchange involving Russia. And of course, if this Third World War got out of hand, it could very quickly become nuclear. And in 1969, this insider said this: if there were too many people in the right places who resisted this world dictatorship that he said was coming, there might be a need to use one or two, possibly more, nuclear weapons. This would possibly be needed to convince people that we mean business. By the time one or two of those went off, then everybody, even the most reluctant, he said, would yield. He said that, and this is the point of the aftermath, he said that the negotiated peace would be very convincing in a context that the whole thing was rehearsed, but nobody would know it. See, this is what's happening. You know, they call wars theatres of war. And in so many ways, that's what it is. The whole thing's a theatre. It's a game with actors playing their parts. Sometimes they know their parts, and sometimes they're ignorant, but they play their part because of that ignorance. And it's the whole thing is a perception deception, because from perception comes everything. Perception leads to action or no action, or what action, all depending on the perception. So this is a whole mind game to impose a perception of reality and world events upon the public that suits the outcome that these psychopaths want. So this insider went on. People hearing about the peace deal after the war and the nuclear exchange would be convinced that it was a genuine negotiation between hostile enemies who finally had come to the realization that peace was better than war. And I'm going to come to that in a second, because talk about the West, United States, Britain, Russia, China. But it depends what level you're talking about, because things look very different depending on what level you are perceiving this whole situation from. Like I say, I'll come to that in a second. But the demonization of Russia is becoming so blatant and so obviously coordinated. You've got shots of horrific shots of children in Aleppo in Syria now, being blamed for their death and injuries. Russia being blamed for that. And of course, if you drop bombs where people live, you're going to hit people that are civilians. The point is, the United States, Britain, NATO countries have been killing children and maiming children decade after decade after decade, and certainly in the Middle East in more recent times, year after year after year. Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, Syria. And where was all the outrage then from the Western media about the children killed and maimed by Western bombing? But suddenly, the demonization of Russia suits perfectly the presentation of Russia as the evil one killing children. Where were you? Excuses for journalists when the Western countries were and still are doing it. You have a situation where Saudi Arabia has now said that it would be prepared to put ground forces into Syria. The United Arab Emirates has said the same, and other Arab countries, and these are all, once again, the usual suspects, yawn, yawn, who do whatever the United States and the hidden hand tells them to do. You've had the BBC program, and you've got Russia now saying that it's aware that Turkey is making preparations for an invasion of Syrian territory. And it's all coming together. What I've been saying about this Third World War and the conflict between the West and Russia, China, is that it was planned to be triggered out of the Middle East. And now you have a situation where those very countries, because behind the Assad regime, supporting him with bombing and military support, is Russia, but also supporting the Assad regime is China, and also another target for this hidden hand, Iran. And you've got America in there, you've got Britain in there, you've got France in there, and on the sidelines there, you've got Israel in there too. And so in that small area of the world, Syria, you've got all the potential for what they want to break out. But like I said a few moments ago, there are different levels of looking at this, because knowledge of this global plan for world takeover and the transformation of global society into a Orwellian tyranny and then some, the knowledge of that and the information surrounding that is fiercely compartmentalized. What you're looking at is, well, you can symbolize it in many ways. You can symbolize it as a spider's web with a spider in the middle, and each strand going further out knows less and less and less of what the spider knows, and eventually you won't even know the spider exists if you go far enough out. You can do it as a pyramid with a few people at the top dictating to the pyramid, and further you go down the pyramid, the less and less that people in the pyramid know about what the game is that only those at the top really know. And so when you look at one level of this situation in Syria, you can see it as Russia coming in, Putin coming in, to protect an ally in Assad from blatant attempts to remove him and take over Syria by the West using proxy forces like they did in Libya and elsewhere. You can see it at that level. And on one level, that is happening. But if you go deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper into it, you can look at it in another way. The hidden hand that's behind all this, and way beyond the Putins and the Obamas and the Camerons, it has now manipulated the situation it wanted, which was to get Russia and the West in a position where this conflict that they've been planning for so long can break out. And it depends, like I say, what level you're looking at. And here's the doll you would have seen behind me in other video casts. And appropriately, it's a Russian doll. And if you take that to be symbolic of the world that we see, the world you see on the news, the world you read about in the papers, the world you see in your everyday life, and it seems to be a certain way. In most of it, it seems to be random events, random occurrences, random situations. When actually, if you take that off, you find something else inside And that level knows more than the level I've just shown you. But that level also has a level inside that. And the deeper you go into it, the more those levels will know about what's really going on. Getting the place up with these things now. But there are levels and levels and levels, and it keeps going, and it keeps going, until eventually you reach the point. I think that's the last one, is it? No, there's one more. Appropriate. And another one. And that's really appropriate, because if I put that back on there and hold these two together, that is extraordinarily symbolic, for anyone who reads my books and sees how it works, of how that controls that. And only at that level, deep in the hidden hand, deep in the shadows, only at that level do they know, unless you research your backside off and uncover it, do they know the real game, the real agenda, and what world events are really about and where they're meant to lead. Everyone else in these other levels knows less and less of what that knows. And in the end, you've got many, many people within the system, the so-called establishment, who are every day making a contribution to achieving the ends that wants symbolically, with no idea that exists, let alone what it is manipulating the world to be. And if people don't grasp how the world is controlled from the hidden by people who give evil a bad name, extreme psychopaths with no empathy and couldn't care less about the suffering of anybody. In fact, they enjoy it. If you don't realize that, then you're never going to understand the world. But fortunately, more and more people are beginning to see that the world is not like they thought it was. And the demonization of Russia now is all part of what that symbolically has been planning for decades and decades, and then some. Okay, let's have a clear up, and then we'll look at some detail. This BBC program, I watched it. It was a head shaker. It was preparing people for all that the agenda wants in terms of people fearing Russia and thus being open to doing with Russia what these people want. Here's a story about that BBC program. BBC whips up anti-Russian hysteria to apocalyptic levels, it says. Once again, Russia is being featured as Dr. Evil incarnate, the villain that regularly plays opposite peace-loving NATO nations. See, it's a mind game. They're presenting a script. They're presenting a perception of good guys, bad guys. It's a BBC program, it says, that has Moscow initiating an invasion on Latvia, followed up by a nuclear strike on Britain. And just in time for the military-industrial shopping season, it says. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia has failed Western analysts and political pundits in spectacular fashion. Despite a full court effort to portray Russia as a barbaric land-grabbing nation obsessed with the idea of restoring imperial real estate, Russia has stubbornly refused to play along. Why even dangling the fat bait of Ukraine before Russia's nose could not get Moscow to reach the way or react the way NATO hoped it would. In fact, while NATO has been hot on the warpath against a number of shell-shocked nations across the Middle East, Central Asia, and North Africa, Russia has gone to war on just one occasion, and that was against Georgia, and only after the egomaniacal leader of that tiny Caucasian country tempted fate by stupidly poking the Russian bear first. Now, that leader in Georgia was a guy called Karkashvili. Who was a puppet of the United States, doing what the United States told him. He spent a lot of time in the United States. And now, the same bloke, even though he's from Georgia, has ended up in office in Ukraine, in political office in Ukraine. I mean, it's so blatant. Thus, the BBC has apparently found it necessary to contrive an altered state of reality, a veritable twilight zone, to convince its audience of Russia's real intentions. The result is a military contractor's wet dream, he says, an apocalyptic bunker buster, unsubtly entitled World War III Inside the War Room, that depicts a sweat-inducing showdown between Russia and NATO and the beginning of World War III. It is probably safe to say, the article says here, I would not be playing a plot spoiler by revealing that here that Russia has been typecast as the aggressor. To briefly summarize, after the Russian military rolls over little Latvia for no good strategic reason whatsoever, British military commanders and greying bureaucrats with furrowed brows huddle themselves in a bunker, deciding whether to launch Trident nuclear missiles at Russia in response. The Daily Mail breathlessly described the taxpayer-paid performance as utterly realistic war game, which presents deeply troubling questions, not least with the current political row over government plans to spend £100 billion replacing our fleet of Trident nuclear submarines. Eureka, the article says. At the very time UK military contractors are salivating over the prospect of winning billion-dollar contracts to replace the Queen's collection of Trident nuclear-armed submarines, along comes a state-funded scaremongering film starring arch-villain Russia to lend some credence to the initiative. And the BBC has form here. I think it was May 2004, it did another one of these type programs about a terrorist attack on London on tube trains. And a year later, we had the 7/7 bombings in London, which pretty much mirrored what the BBC program, had been about in one of these, faction things that they call them, documentaries, a year earlier. Just a coincidence, nothing to worry about. Russian lawmaker Franz Kiltsevich, or Klintsevich, told the Russian news service radio station that the film will give NATO an opportunity to remind member states that they should crack open their tattered purses and boost their military spending. They, the West, he said, have always demonized Russia, trying to show that it is uncontrolled and non-European. As for what happens recently, we qualified this a long time ago as an information war, a very serious and profound one. Today, the US has a very serious problem of rearmament. The military and industrial sector needs to get financing. A mechanism of the corrupt American elite has been launched, and this was in Iraq, is in Syria and around Europe, he said. Meanwhile, the Kremlin provided a tongue-in-cheek critique of the BBC film. Unfortunately, our colleagues from the BBC have lately resorted to making public products of quite low quality. Therefore, we haven't been able to see, or we haven't been in a hurry, rather, to familiarise ourselves with them. So whenever the BBC does that and starts to obviously play out a particular party line, in this case demonizing Russia, then you know it's part of the agenda. The BBC is an extraordinarily controlled organization. And again, most people working for it will have no idea that is so. So now we have a story, the Kremlin talking about Russia-Turkey relations. The worst in decades, no way to improve now in terms of their relations. Now, Turkey is very, very significant in all this because it's had a massive fallout with Russia, of course, over the bringing down of the Russian plane over Syria, not Turkey. The evidence strongly suggests, and even the Turkish authorities are saying that the Russian plane was only in their airspace for 17 seconds. Russia says it wasn't at all, but 17 seconds, and they shot it down. It was all premeditated. Of course it was. And there are many reasons that Turkey is important. First of all, it's got a lunatic leader, Erdogan, and it is the conduit for arming, funding, supplying ISIS in the attack on the Assad regime in Syria. But more than that, it's a member of NATO. And NATO have this Article 5, which says an attack on one member is considered an attack on them all. And this means that an attack by Russia, or a perceived attack by Russia on Turkey, would activate Article 5, which would bring the NATO countries in a conflict, or in the situation at least, between Russia and Turkey, supporting Turkey. And you saw when Turkey brought that plane down, that Russian plane down, how NATO was immediately behind Turkey. Oh, it has a right to defend itself. And you can see from that reaction what would happen if Russia and Turkey got into conflict. So this story says relations between Russia and Turkey have deteriorated so far it is virtually impossible to normalize them. Vladimir Putin's spokesman Dmitry Peskov has declared. Moscow is still expecting an apology from Ankara. That's over this bringing down of the plane. Peskov dismissed a comment made by German Chancellor Angela Merkel about alleged suffering caused to civilians by Russian airstrikes in Syria. This is around Aleppo. What Chancellor Merkel had said was that she was shocked by the sufferings of tens of thousands of people caused by Russian airstrikes. Well, and it's funny, she never said that at any point over American, British and NATO airstrikes. And she called on the UN Security Council to oblige all parties to immediately stop the alleged bombardment of civilian population and civilian facilities. Ditto. And the Kremlin spokesman said, regrettably, we heard no such assessments. Quite right, actually, whatever you think about Russia or whatever. Regrettably, he said, we heard no such statements regarding the barbaric actions of terrorists who were advancing on Syrian territory, encircling Syrian defense forces and the country's legitimate authorities. He said, recalling the situation in Syria 2 to 3 years ago, we heard no such statements from anyone back then. And the article goes on to say that the unrest in Syria initially began in the early spring of 2011 amidst nationwide demonstrations against President Bashar Assad and his government. And those demonstrations were, like the rebels in Libya, etc., were instigated by Western-funded, armed, and supported, trained insurgents to bring about the so-called Arab Spring in different countries, which was just a way of starting this wave of war and conflict. Now, what Russia has been saying this week is that Turkey is preparing for military action in Syria. Now, given what I've just said about conflict breaking out, because Russia's obviously in there as well, in Syria, and Article 5, well, the consequences of where this could lead are immense. The story says the Russian Defense Ministry spokesman says Moscow has serious grounds to suspect Turkey of preparing for a military incursion into Syria. The Russian Defense Ministry registers a growing number of signs of hidden preparation of the Turkish armed forces for active actions on the territory of Syria, Igor Konashenkov said on Thursday. We are recording more and more signs of concealed preparations by the Turkey military, he said. Meanwhile, Russia's foreign ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova dismissed Ankara's claims that the Russian warplanes in the bringing down of the Russian plane violated Turkish airspace as ungrounded. Turkey seeks to overthrow the Syrian government while Russia has been supporting the Syrian government in the fight against terrorism, the story goes. So, once again, when you see the way it's all been set up, you have Russia, China, Iran on one side, and you have NATO countries on the other in that small area of land, comparatively, of Syria. And therefore, you've got the sides already there. And there's already a proxy war going on because Russia is attacking the so-called, and anything but the so-called moderate rebels that are the proxy army of the West. And also ISIS, another proxy army of the West, while the West is supporting those people overtly with the moderate rebels and covertly with the ISIS mob. So it's all kind of there, waiting to be triggered. Syria invasion plan. Turkey will defend its Aleppo brothers, says Turkey Prime Minister. Of course, what's happening now, and it's one of the reasons that the Western countries like the United States are panicking, is that on one level, going back to what I said earlier, on one level, Russia is being very successful in supporting the Assad army in getting back territory from these moderate rebels in ISIS. And that's not really the idea, on one level anyway. But of course, on a deeper level, the idea is to bring them into conflict anyway. So on one level, it will be suiting what is happening. The Turkish Prime Minister pledged to return a historical debt to Turkey's Aleppo brothers, which is where currently Russia and the Assad army is pushing into Aleppo, taking more and more of it back, which is not the idea. It's the last thing that Turkey wants. And that they will support their Aleppo brothers who helped to defend the country in the early 20th century. And he said this just days after Russia warned of Ankara's intentions to invade Syria as the rebels there falter. Exactly, they're going to try and do what they can to stop Assad and the Russian forces taking back the land that's been taken from them. We will return our historic debt, the Prime Minister says. And when you break down what he's talking about, historically, it's a load of old tosh. The Defense Ministry spokesman in Russia, Major General Igor Konashenkov, I mentioned earlier, told reporters in Moscow that Turkey had cancelled an agreement upon Russian observation flights that had been scheduled over its territory because of its illicit activities. Because one of the things, of course, that Turkey is doing, it's getting oil from ISIS-controlled refineries and oil supplies, and getting it out of Syria to sell. And it's one of the major forms of funding for this ISIS. And of course, the last thing that Turkey would want would be Russian air surveillance, showing that to be the case. And Konashenkov pointed out that Turkey has already been supplying terrorists in the Syrian cities of Idlib and Aleppo with manpower and weaponry. Nothing of this is mentioned with the condemnation of Russia for its attack on Aleppo. And the spokesman showed a media photo of a checkpoint and said that although this very border crossing, mainly at night time, or through this border crossing, the militants who seized the city of Aleppo in northwest Syria are being supplied with arms and fighters from Turkish territory. The alarming new developments come as jihadi forces fighting President Assad's army in northern Syria are suffering losses and retreating to the Turkish border. Moscow has provided the international community with video evidence that Turkish artillery had fired on populated Syrian areas in the north of Latakia province. No mention of that in the mainstream media that I've seen. And the story goes on, allegations that Ankara is planning an invasion of Syria come amid what would appear to be growing disconnect between Turkey and the US over their respective ambitions for the region. Notably, Turkey considers the US-backed Kurdish fighters in Syria to be terrorists akin to the Kurdish rebels fighting in eastern Turkey. I mean, I hope you're following this. Everyone's fighting everyone else. Now, this thing with the Kurds, the Kurds have been fighting ISIS all these months and months and months. But instead of doing it together with Turkey supposedly fighting ISIS, actually supplying them, Turkey have been attacking the Kurds who are fighting ISIS, because it's all a game, it's all a script, and the contradictions are only contradictions if you think that what they say they want to do is what they want to do. Once you realize what's really going on, they're not contradictions at all. They are what would happen if what was going on was going on. I.e., you create ISIS, you arm and fund the moderate rebels, and then in terms of ISIS, you're supposed to be fighting them, but you're not. You're supplying them. You might, kill a few and bomb a bit here, but you're not trying to actually stop them because you want them to remove Assad for you as a proxy army. And so what's happened is the Russians have come in and meant it, and suddenly, they're having success in pushing ISIS back. This is why the West are kicking off and saying, "Oh, there's Russia this, Russia that," and what the Russians have shown is that the West wasn't trying to remove ISIS before, and has made that blatantly clear by what's happened. Then there's Saudi Arabia in all this. Saudi Arabia ready to invade Syria with ground forces. Whatever Saudi Arabia does, America and Israel have told it to do. It's that simple. A Saudi military spokesman has confirmed that Riyadh is prepared to join any US-led ground operations to fight Daesh, ISIS, in Syria, if such operations are approved by the coalition, if we're told to do it, in other words. The kingdom is ready to participate in any ground operations that the coalition may agree to carry out in Syria, said Brigadier General Ahmed Asseri on Arabic TV. Asseri is also the spokesman for the Saudi-led Arab coalition in Yemen. That's another coalition, not of the willing, but of the killing, that's US and British supported, where they're killing and maiming children in Yemen. Western media. Oh, sorry, gone deaf. If there was a consensus for the leadership of the coalition, i.e., if America told us, the kingdom is willing to participate in these efforts because we believe that aerial operations are not the ideal solution and must have a twin mix of aerial and ground operations. Now, I've been writing for the months and months and years since this began, that the plan all along has been for troops on the ground and a ground war. And of course, you've got Obama and Cameron denying that, no boots on the ground. We're not going into another war. Well, you are, and you are. And now we're seeing this whole ground war scenario being openly talked about, just like World War III is being openly talked about. He goes on, asked about the report, this is the Saudi bloke, asked about the report that what the Saudi guy said about ground operations. US State Department spokesman John Kirby said that the coalition is generally welcome to its partners, increasing support in the fight against Daesh, against Assad and the Russians, but could not comment specifically on those comments. The US-led coalition has conducted airstrikes against ISIS since September of 2014, but the campaign has done little to stymie the terrorist group's influence, because it wasn't meant to. While President Obama has repeatedly stated that he will not place additional boots on the ground in the Middle East, US Defense Secretary Ashton Carter has indicated that the Pentagon may be reconsidering that policy. No, they've got to that point where that policy is due to be implemented, as they knew all along. By comparison, the Russian air campaign has started last September, has carried out thousands of sorties and has already proven effective against ISIS, working at the behest of the legitimate government of Syrian President Bashar Assad. Russian air support and Syrian ground troops are beating back the terrorist groups. Now, with what's unfolding now, you can get another fix or another angle on why the United States has armed Saudi Arabia, Israel, Egypt to such a fantastic extent in comparison to their defense needs. One of the things I've been pointing out through the decades is that this whole agenda is not made up as they go along. They'll tinker it as they go along, but the basic structure and what it wants to achieve is not made up as they go along. It's long planned. So the idea of arming these countries in that area to the teeth in preparation for what they plan to happen in terms of a war, a world war, is absolutely par for the course. Oh, I've got an itch. Excuse me. 150,000 Saudi mercenaries ready to enter Syria is another story from this week. Informed sources revealed that Riyadh is holding training courses for 150,000 Saudi, Sudanese, Egyptian and Jordanian forces to prepare them for war in Syria, where Russia are. The Saudi sources told the CNN channel that the 150,000 strong army is now stationed in Saudi Arabia and will soon be dispatched to Syria. They also said that Morocco, Turkey, Bahrain, another Western-controlled royal dictatorship, the UAE and Qatar will also deploy their forces to Syria through the Turkish borders, and Malaysia, Indonesia and Brunei will dispatch mercenaries to Saudi Arabia too. These kind of mercenaries are just a proxy army for the major players. That's what happened in Libya. Riyadh has been a member of the US-led coalition that has been launching airstrikes against ISIS in Syria since September 2014 without the permission of Damascus or the United Nations. And in December 2015, Saudi Arabia started its own Muslim 34-nation coalition to allegedly fight Islamic extremism. That's another proxy army for the United States and NATO. ISIS is a Wahhabi group mentored by Saudi Arabia and has been blacklisted as a terrorist group everywhere in the world, including the United States and Russia, but not in Saudi Arabia. Both Tehran and Moscow have issued stern warnings to Riyadh, stressing that the Saudi intruders, who in fact intend to rescue the terrorists that are sustaining heavy defeats these days, will be crushed in Syria. UAE joins chorus of Arab monarchies ready to invade Syria. You can see the pattern. It's so bloody obvious. Following in the footsteps of Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates stated on Sunday that it was ready to send ground troops to Syria to fight Islamic State. Yeah, okay. Damascus earlier said it would send unwelcomed invaders back in coffins. What a wonderful world we live in. The UAE's preparedness to participate in a ground military operation in Syria was confirmed by Minister of State for Foreign Affairs, Anwar Kardash, who said that US leadership on this would be a prerequisite. Like I say, when they tell us to do it, we'll do it. We dare not. The Syrian government warned that any foreign army entering Syria without an invitation will be considered an enemy and resisted. Let no one think that they can attack Syria or violate its sovereignty, because I assure you any aggressor will return to their country in a wooden coffin, said the Syrian foreign minister. And Iran, the key regional ally of Syria and a rival of Saudi Arabia, said Riyadh lacked the courage to deliver the promise. But maybe it lacks the courage even more to say no to the United States, and particularly the hidden hand that I'm talking about. Russia, which is providing air support to the Syrian government army in a campaign separate from the US-led coalition, dismissed the Saudi statement, pointing out the lack of progress in its other ongoing military operation in Yemen. Saudi Arabia sent its warplanes and troops to the neighboring country of Yemen to fight against the Shiite rebels from the Ansar Allah movement, also known as Houthis, and the intervention which the United Arab Emirates is supporting militarily, and of course they're using United States weapons, resulted in significant civilian casualties and a humanitarian crisis, but has not seen a military victory. Where are the pictures of the children there in the Western media that are being slaughtered by Saudi Arabia and these other lunatics in Yemen? Russia has said this week that it's not the Russian operation, but NATO's incursion in the Middle East that's to blame for the Syrian crisis. And again, you know, whatever people think about Russia and Putin, that is blatantly true. Russia's defense ministry has slammed NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg, he's in my books going way back. He is absolute puppet of the hidden hand. If the Russian Defense Ministry has slammed him, in the words of this article, labeling as nonsense his comments that the Russian air operation in Syria is causing tensions and undermining the peace process in the country. The NATO Secretary General made the controversial statement on Friday when he arrived at the EU Defence Ministers meeting in Amsterdam. He said, "The intense Russia airstrikes, mainly targeting opposition groups in Syria, are undermining the efforts to find a political solution to the conflict, also causing increased tensions and violations of Turkish airspace." And it's all part of this demonization of Russia and getting people to fear Russia. The comments that the Russian air operation is the source of tensions in Syria is nonsense, said Konashenko, the Major General from earlier, Russia's Defense Ministry spokesman. He said, if anybody in Syria is tense today because of the actions of the Russian airspace forces in Syria, it's the terrorists, he said. As for why the NATO countries should feel tense as the terrorists, it's a question to be addressed by Stoltenberg himself. The spokesman reminded of the openness with which the Russian air operation in Syria is being carried out, including daily briefings and release of videos and photos. According to the spokesman, the possibility of peace talks between the Syrian government and opposition wasn't even discussed in the West before Moscow sent its warplanes into the country. Only the deadline for the complete destruction of the country, in accordance with the Libyan scenario, where NATO countries have been freely establishing Western-style democracy, was specified, he said. The Russian involvement made the Syrians start believing that it is still possible to fight and eliminate international terrorism in their country. And that, again, is obviously true in terms of what the guy was saying. And this is one of the, like I say, reasons on one level of this why they're getting their knickers in a twist over Russia in Syria. And in part, why they're trying to get a ceasefire. They want a ceasefire. The West wants a ceasefire involving Russian bombing. But at this point, as I'm speaking, they haven't got that. And this is the point of, like I say, why their knickers are in a twist at the moment. End of ISIS, ? Russian jets hit 900 targets in the last 3 days, jihadists fleeing. The end of ISIS may be near as Russian strikes are forcing the jihadists to flee to the Turkish border. Now, they're a proxy army for the West and United States, Britain. So the last thing they want is Russia defeating them. Russia's intervention in Syria has produced many astounding results, the article says, since it began late last year, and they seem to be continuing into the new year too. In order to retain at least some semblance of a fighting capacity, the militant forces in the Syria's northern regions continue abandoning their positions and falling back to the Turkish border, said a Russian spokesman. Furthermore, despite widespread Western alarmist claims of besieged settlements as they seek to further demonize Assad and the Syrian government, the Russian spokesman reports that the soldiers of the Syrian Arab Army, aided by popular forces, have driven back the militants in the province of Aleppo and lifted the blockade from the settlements elsewhere that were besieged over 4 years. And the article says it's very interesting to hear that the fleeing terrorists are heading towards Turkey, as Russia now believes that Turkey is planning a ground invasion of Syrian territory. And this article captures what is really going on now. US now overtly at war with Russia. That's becoming more and more obvious. It quotes old Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, approving the American defense proposals to quadruple US armaments and troops in Europe against, quote, Russian aggression. Talking about Ukraine, of course. Secretary Carter has said earlier the same day in his announcement of America's arming for war against Russia, we are reinforcing our posture in Europe to support our NATO allies in the face of Russia's aggression. In Pentagon parlance, this is called the European Reassurance Initiative. And after requesting about $800 million for last year, this year we're more than quadrupling it for a total of $3.4 billion in 2017. This will fund a lot of things, the American guy said. More rotational US forces in Europe, more training and exercising with our allies, more preposition and war fighting gear and infrastructure improvements to support all of this. And when combined with US forces already in and assigned to Europe, which are also substantial, all of this together by the end of 2017 will let us rapidly form a highly capable combined arms ground force that can respond across that theater if necessary. Respond to Russia, of course. However, the truth is that this article says Russia is not expanding into NATO's borders. NATO is expanding to Russia's borders, and the boldness of the Western lie to the contrary is an insult to Western intelligence. And of course, the Russians know, as anyone who observes the situation knows, that Ukraine has been taken over by the West, and that's a way of getting closer and closer to a conflict with Russia on the ground. The article says the US is preparing for an invasion of Russia. By the end of 2017, the US will be prepared to invade Russia. See, that's what the build-up's all about. It's not build-up for build-up's sake. It's because it's leading somewhere. Secretary Carter went on to say, Russia and China are our most stressing competitors. That Ike's a nutter. They have developed and are continuing to advance military systems that seek to threaten our advantages in specific areas, and in some cases they are developing weapons and ways of wars that seek to achieve their objectives rapidly before they hope we can respond. Fear, 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 Cold War, here we go again. Because of this, and because of their actions to date, from Ukraine to the South China Sea, the Department of Defense has elevated their importance in our defense planning and budgeting. No, we're reaching the point in the sequence where it's getting closer and closer to all-out conflict with those countries. Since he is Secretary of Defense instead of Secretary of Offense, which it really is, he immediately added, while we do not desire conflict of any kind with either of these nations, and let me be clear, that's all there was to the assertion there. He didn't finish the sentence, nor even the thought. He often makes grammatical errors, of which that's an example. But in his off-handed way, he did at least try to give the impression that the US is never an aggressor. For example, that though the US is expanding NATO right up to Russia's borders, thanks to Ukraine, Russia is being the aggressor to move troops and weapons up to those borders, up to Russia's own borders, to counter the US and NATO invasion threat. But no, it's to threaten NATO, if you believe the West. In the statements by Ash Carter, Barack Obama, and Jens Stoltenberg, that's Russian aggression. In the allegory of George Orwell's 1984, America's rhetoric is simply newspeak. Now, Britain's involved in all this as well. Britain beefs up NATO navy to counter Russian moves in the Baltic. You can see the pieces being moved around. Britain is sending 5 warships and 530 naval personnel to join NATO's maritime arm as the alliance boosts its military force to counter what it sees as a growing Russian threat. British troops will also be stationed on the ground in the Baltic states near to the Russian borders. It emerged yesterday. NATO defense ministers will today also approve measures, including the stockpiling of weapons in bases in Eastern Europe. The US has quadrupled its budget for forces in Europe to $3.4 billion and has announced that half of this will be spent on a heavy brigade of armour and artillery in Western Europe. Global Hawk surveillance drones, previously used in Afghanistan, will be based in Sicily and used to gather intelligence from all of NATO's borders and elsewhere. The British deployment, the first to NATO's maritime force in 6 years, will consist, and it goes on to talk about the vessels that will be involved. Michael Fallon, the Defence Secretary, said, increasingly, our NATO deployment sends a strong message to our enemies. See, Russia's the enemy now. Suddenly, you've got to watch the language, because you watch the language change, then where we are in the agenda has changed. So Russia's now the enemy. China is the enemy. Not long ago, they were not the enemy, but we've reached that point in the process. increasingly our NATO deployment strong message to our enemies that we are ready to respond to any threat and defend our allies. 2016 will see a particular focus on the Baltic region with our ships sent there as part of the Maritime Group, the Mine Countermeasure Group, and the Boltrops exercise. Old Stoltenberg, he's off again. He said that all member states were agreed on the need for action. He said, I expect ministers to agree to enhance our forward presence in the eastern part of our alliance. This will boost our collective defence and at the same time send a powerful signal to deter any aggression or intimidation. Western leaders regard the new measures as imperative because of the increasing aggression by the Kremlin. This is in the Independent newspaper. It calls itself the Independent. I love it. Just playing the game, just like the others. Russian aggression by the Kremlin, including Russia's annexation of Crimea and its support for separatists in eastern Ukraine. Former members of the Soviet-dominated Warsaw Pact are now part of NATO and have repeatedly called for a show of strength from the alliance to head off Russian aggression. A NATO summit in Warsaw, Poland in the summer will work out the composition of Western forces to be stationed in 6 Baltic states. It is believed that up to 6,000 troops will be stationed in these countries, and each contingent will have a substantial proportion of soldiers from Western NATO members, the UK, USA, Germany, and France. Now, when you start to put the dates together, they're talking about having all this in place by 2017 in Europe, etc. And they've got this meeting to work this part of it out in the summer of 2016. You can start to see a kind of a timescale unfolding for when they wanted this all to kick off. Mass starvation fears in Aleppo amid claims that Russian bombs killed children. Mass starvation fears in place after place after place after place after place amid claims that Western bombs kill children. I've never seen that headline. Again, we're in the Independent. You can trust the Independent. It's Independent. Horrifying images of Syrian children wounded by suspected Russian airstrikes emerged yesterday, fueling growing international anger at Moscow's pounding of civilians in apparent defiance of international law, as if the West could care less about international law. And of course, because they're psychopaths, these children and all the suffering, like I've been saying all this time, they don't just have no empathy with that suffering, they get off on it because of who they are and what they are, if you go deeper and deeper and deeper beyond just the human level. And this goes on about, it's just horrible describing the suffering of children in Syria. But instead of sharing out the blame and pointing out that it all started because the United States and Britain, Israel, the gang, started this war in the first place, started this civil war to get rid of Assad, they don't go into that because that's not what people are supposed to know. It's horrible. But anyway, here's a story from a real journalist. I've mentioned him before. It's called Peter Oborne. And he's got a headline here, Inside the City of the Damned. And the subheadline is, As a Human Tide Flees Aleppo for Europe, Peter Oborne sends a devastating dispatch from the war-torn Syrian city. Now, this is a real journalist who's actually been in Aleppo and seen what's going on and who's doing it. And it really is an excellent report, and very rare that you see this sort of quality journalism in the mainstream. He's talking about being downstairs in what was once a very famous hotel, and now a place where people try to find refuge. Downstairs, in what had been the grand salon, another of the hotel's new guests told me her harrowing story. He says, fighters from the Free Syrian Army, moderate rebels supported by the West, fighters from the Free Syrian Army, the rebel faction hailed by the British government as moderate, took over her village 3 years ago. They forced her to wear black, veil her face, and stay at home. Moderate rebels, see. Thanks to the fighting, her husband lost his job as a house builder. Eventually, they made the decision to flee, leaving behind everything they owned. Now her husband makes a miserable living by selling vegetables in the street, while her 12-year-old son works unpaid at a nearby tailor. Oborn says it's only 4 years ago that the northern city of Aleppo was one of the most prosperous and beautiful in the Middle East. Tourists from around the world visited its ancient mosques and churches, fabulous citadel, and the largest covered market in the world. Aleppo was also the industrial powerhouse of Syria, with buoyant textile and pharmaceutical companies sustaining a booming population of well over 2 million. Now, almost everything has been destroyed by war. President Assad's army has managed to hang on to the west of the city, while the east is dominated by rebel groups which include al-Nusra, the Syrian affiliate of Al-Qaeda. I thought they were on the other side. I must keep up. And Islamic State. The fighting has spurred countless refugees to head north to Turkey and thence to Europe. I discovered that the famed Aleppo University has been turned into a giant camp with 17 out of its 20 dormitory blocks used by displaced families, some of whom asleep a dozen or more to a room designed for 2 students. One man, who looked 75, though he assured me he was only 50, told how his family home and olive oil business in the old city of Aleppo had been destroyed by the Islamists of al-Nusra. The terror group beheaded one member of his family and ripped another apart by tying him between an electricity pylon and a moving car. Another family member has been kidnapped and no one knows where he is. One man, who had been a tailor in peacetime, told me he came into western Aleppo to flee Free Syrian Army fighters, who promptly came after him and made an unsuccessful attempt to abduct his daughter from their university shelter. These are the moderate rebels! Such are the horrors, Oborn says, that pass for everyday life in this benighted city. The inhabitants are now so accustomed to the sounds of shell and mortar fire, they no longer look up when they hear an explosion. Can you imagine what this is doing to people? What this is doing to kids? I met one schoolmistress who had just made a terrifying journey from her home in an Islamic State-controlled area just east of Aleppo to collect her monthly salary of 30,000 Syrian pounds, about £50 English, from the Education Directorate in the city centre. Before the war, this journey had taken barely 40 minutes. Hers had taken 5 days as she made her way across al-Nusra and Islamic State roadblocks. The teacher told me that in her hometown she was made to dress entirely in black. She said simply, "They will kill me if I show any flesh." She was forced to live indoors except when being ordered into the public square to witness the frequent beheadings and crucifixions. Now, here we bloody go. Intriguingly, she told me the foreigner fighters who controlled her area included French, British, Egyptians, Afghans and Americans, quote, very blonde Americans and black ones. Islamic State, this is. Islamic State does not allow her to teach, but she is still paid by the Syrian government. This brave and stoical woman would shortly make the journey back to rejoin her husband and young children. She told me she had no doubt that the advancing Syrian government army would soon retake her hometown. Then the Islamic State will booby-trap the houses and use us as human shields, she said. Aleppo today, talking about the suffering of the people that's being all blamed on the Russians by these psychopaths of the West. And, you know, I've got no brief for Putin. Just another leader who rules by iron and answers to the hidden hand. Just more intelligent than some of these buggers. Okay, Aleppo today is a city of darkness and cold. Electricity has been cut for more than 3 months, and there has been no water for 12 days by the time I reached the city. And here we go again. In both cases, Islamic State is to blame, he says. Its fighters hold the power station which supplies electricity. They're now besieged by the Syrian army. Aleppo's water comes from the Euphrates River to the east via a giant water processing plant, which is also under ISIS's control. But it's all the Russian fault why people are suffering in Aleppo. The people make do with private generators, but they are expensive, and most families can only afford a dull electric light. For water, they dig wells, but many cannot wash regularly. Doctors told me there was an epidemic of fleas in the city, and that they fear cholera when the summer comes. Doctors told me of a deadly shortage of medical supplies, and when they try to go to Islamic State-controlled areas to deliver those supplies, they are often insulted and turned away. As a result, long-forgotten diseases are being seen again. Even polio, eradicated 10 years ago, is making a return. People of Aleppo have a phrase for the kind of life they are living. They call it dead alive. No wonder, Oborn says, so many are fleeing large parts of the city, which feels empty. Of the more than 2 million who lived in Aleppo before the conflict, there are probably fewer than 800,000 today. One man, a lawyer, told me that 3/4 of his friends left Aleppo last summer. He guessed that the estimated 200,000 Christian population before the conflict was now only around 25,000. They know all too well what Islamic State will do to Christians. And this brings us to this other part of all this, which is the enormous influx of refugees and opportunists into Europe, which is all planned to destabilize Europe and create conflict in Europe between the refugees and opportunists and the European population in those countries. We're already seeing it happen. And it's to break down order. The more you break down order, the more you can justify the police state. And as I've said in previous video casts and in the books, it's to break down a sense of culture so that they will dilute the resistance to the end of sovereign nations in Europe, and centrally controlled regions, centrally controlled by bureaucrats in Brussels, will replace them. This is a story here, 3 million more coming into Europe, the headline indicates. Warning over new influxes, 76,000 crossed the Mediterranean in the past 6 weeks. Up to 3 million asylum seekers will arrive in Europe in the next 2 years, a report reveals. Research by the think tank Migration Watch says the EU's asylum system is unable to cope after 1.27 million people, many fleeing humanitarian disasters in Africa, the Middle East, etc., sought refuge last year, an increase of 95%. And You see nothing yet. It adds the EU border agency, Frontex, recorded 1.8 million illegal border crossings in 2015. Meanwhile, the EU Commission estimate that around 3 million irregular migrants will enter the EU between now and 2017. So this 2017 year keeps coming up. Shock figures showed 10 times as many migrants arrived in Europe by sea in the first 6 weeks of the year as the same period in 2015. Turkey is the main gateway to Europe, with nearly 1 million migrants crossing the Aegean to the Greek islands since the start of last year. And at the same time, this week, here's the headline, "Open your border, EU chiefs tell Turks." Because while on one side there, the EU is saying, oh, it's a massive problem, we can't cope. On the other side, they're saying to Turkey, open your borders and let more and more people in. Now, we can obviously have empathy for that because of the suffering in Syria that I've just been describing. But that's not why they want to open the borders. They want to open the borders to get more and more people into Europe, and in doing so, get more and more of, which are the majority of opportunists, to come in because they want to change the nature of European society for the reasons I've described. All these dots connect. So the story goes, Turkey should welcome Syrian refugees fleeing the siege of Aleppo, EU officials said yesterday. As politicians in Ankara warned of a possible million-strong influx, Brussels chiefs called for the gates to be opened to the tens of thousands already at the border. Crossing points remained firmly shut for the third day yesterday as thousands more men, women and children arrived and set up makeshift camps. Turkey's president, old Erdogan, insists that he is ready to open the gates if necessary, when told. It is feared this could lead to an intensification of the refugee crisis in Europe because Turkey has served as a stepping stone to the West ever since the outbreak of the Syrian civil war in 2011. Another part of this migrant story, NATO will send in the warships. This is another excuse for NATO to get warships into that area around the Aegean and Turkey and just down towards Syria. Warships will be deployed to stop migrants crossing the Aegean Sea to Europe under a plan to be discussed by NATO defence chiefs today. German Chancellor Angela Merkel, the one who just opened the German borders and said as many come in as you want, no checks, nothing, with the consequences that have followed. And people were saying, well, that's crazy. Why is she doing that? Well, why she was doing that is because she's down to her bone marrow an operative for this hidden hand and the agenda I'm talking about. And now she has the nerve to say we've got to do something about it. German Chancellor Angela Merkel last night called on allies to send vessels to patrol the Turkish coast in a dramatic escalation of the response to the crisis. Today, at a meeting in Brussels, defence ministers will consider the request supported by Turkey for military action aimed at preventing people smuggling gangs sending boatloads to the Greek islands. A decision to intervene by the 28 NATO members, including Britain, will be seen as an admission that the EU has failed to tackle the problem. It's not even trying. NATO Secretary General, God, he's everywhere this week, he is, old Stoltenberg, said last night that its members see the need to manage and to tackle the human tragedy caused by NATO countries, which he says is caused by the migrant crisis, which is caused by the NATO countries. He said, I think it will take very seriously the request from Turkey and other allies to look into what NATO can do to help them cope and deal with the crisis and all the challenges they face, not least in Turkey, and that will let us get some more warships down in the area that we want to put them. And while this is going on, the media propaganda campaign begins for Cameron's new war. British Prime Minister, new war. Where could that be? Pray. In Libya. In Libya. Because what's happened in Libya is the American, British, NATO bombing of Libya, French, so devastated the country, destroyed all the structure, destroyed the government of Gaddafi, and left a massive hole, vacuum, in which ISIS could pour, exactly as planned. And so now they're saying, oh, there's a big problem with Libya because ISIS is taking over Libya and we've got to go in and get ISIS out of Libya. David Cameron is deciding whether to ask the UK if he can wage another war. How many does he want? This time in Libya. His deliberation over military intervention in the country comes just a couple of months after the heated vote in Parliament on Cameron's request for airstrikes in Syria. That deeply contested win for the Prime Minister, 397 to 223 in favour, had very little support from the UK public. No, it doesn't. But they don't matter to these people. They have no interest what the public think. They have to follow the agenda. That's all they care about. So the mainstream media have already dutifully begun pushing the pro-military action propaganda to make Cameron's plea, if he makes it, more palatable this time around, which is the same theme as the demonisation of Russia. The debate on military action in Libya has gained momentum following a recent US intelligence assessment. We made it up. Reportedly, an anonymous defense official has claimed the findings show ISIS is declining in Iraq and Syria, thanks to Russia in Syria, but gaining ground in Libya. Oh, you must want to go into Libya now then. Kerry said, the Secretary of State, John Kerry, we're still not at the victory that we want to achieve and will achieve in either Syria or Iraq, and we have seen Daesh, ISIS, playing a game of expanding out into other countries, particularly Libya. The last thing in the world you want is a false caliphate with access to billions of dollars of oil revenue. Say that about the American government. France is also said to be keen, oh, you do surprise me, to move towards a military solution. What, like the last military solution in Libya? And Italy has suggested it would consider being involved. In fact, an Algerian newspaper recently reported that the US, UK and France have already informed the Algerian government that they are planning airstrikes on ISIS in Libya, although their claim could not be independently verified. As the last decade and a half have shown, it's not unusual for Western governments to use military action as a first result rather than the last. They refuse to learn lessons from past wars. Well, that's where people miss the point. They refuse to learn lessons from past wars. It's not about learning lessons. They know what the outcome's going to be. That's why they're doing it. And Tom Pride, he says here, who's a writer, has pointed out that very few UK strikes have actually occurred in Syria because of the lack of available targets in a battle with so many players. Extraordinarily, the UK even targeted oil fields that were already supposedly obliterated by Russia. That's how sparse genuine targets actually are. Now, this was pointed out at the time when Cameron was trying to get support from the cannon fodder yes men and women in Parliament to send British planes to bomb in Syria. It was pointed out by some people with a brain that how many people do you want bombing the bloody place? Well, why does Britain have to get involved as well? But that wasn't the point. I mean, it's clear they're not going to bomb in Syria to bomb ISIS targets. But what it's done, getting them to getting Parliament to agree, it's got Britain into Syria. So anything now that kicks off in that area will also involve Britain because it's now officially there. It says an external intervention could help ISIS in Libya to enlarge the cooperation with other radical groups and make ISIS stronger. Just very quick. Oh, another thing on Libya. British military aircraft are already operating over Libya, preempting any formal decision by a national unity government on a repeat of 2011's foreign intervention, it's emerged. British jets already doing what they've not yet asked if they can do. Par for the course. During a session of the Foreign Affairs Committee on the situation in Libya held on Tuesday, Tory Middle East Minister Tobias Ellwood said missions had already begun. And then this one other area of this, that's North Korea. US deploying anti-missile system on North Korea's doorstep. US Senate backs new sanctions on North Korea. Readers of my books and people who watch these videocasts will have heard me talk about the project for the New American Century and its document produced in September 2000, calling for multiple theatre wars and to regime change in Libya, in Iraq, in Syria, in Iran, and China, and North Korea. So you are seeing this list being ticked off as the process and stepping stones unfolds, and now they're focusing on North Korea, and of course North Korea has support from China, and if they go in any way for North Korea, then China will be involved. And what did I say for all these years that they wanted? They wanted a world war between the West and Russia, China. Oh, before I finish, this is the most important story of the week. Amid what has been happening and all that I'm talking about has been this headline about Kate Middleton, the royal wife of Prince William. What has Kate done to her eyebrows? Don't give a shit. See you next week.